January 17, 1945. The Ardennes forest, 23 degrees below freezing, the kind of cold that turned diesel fuel to sludge and made metal burn flesh at the slightest touch. Private First Class Tommy Reicher crouched inside the turret of his M4 Sherman tank, his breath forming clouds in the cramped steel chamber, despite the residual heat from the 75mm gun. Outside, the snow lay 3 feet deep across the Belgian countryside, transforming the landscape into a deceptive blanket of white that concealed foxholes, tank traps, and the frozen corpses of men from both sides. The tank's engine rumbled beneath him, a constant vibration that traveled through the metal floor and into his bones. He could hear the muffled voices of his crewmates over the intercom, tinny and distorted, as Sergeant Morrison called out bearing adjustments to their driver. But what Tommy heard most clearly was the sound that had become the rhythm of his existence for the past 4 hours. The metallic clank and scrape of empty brass casings hitting the turret floor, the heavy thud of another round being shoved into the breech, the sharp chemical smell of cordite that no amount of ventilation could clear from the fighting compartment. They had been firing almost continuously since dawn, and the ready racks that once held neatly stowed ammunition now gaped empty like missing teeth. This was the Battle of the Bulge in its final, desperate phase, what Adolf Hitler had conceived as a lightning strike to split the Allied armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp, had devolved into a grinding meat grinder of attrition. The German offensive, launched with such confidence on December 16th, had pushed a dangerous salient, a bulge, into American lines, catching the Allies off guard in what would become the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. 89,000 Americans would be casualties before it ended. 19,000 would never go home. The Germans would lose twice that number, spending the last reserves of men and material that the Third Reich could never replace. In the snowy forests and frozen fields of Belgium and Luxembourg, 2 visions of the future collided with the force of steel against steel. And in the turret of Sherman tank number 347, designated by the crew simply as the Patriot's Promise, a 20-year-old loader from Dayton, Ohio, was about to prove that American ingenuity could turn salvaged canvas and scrap metal into the difference between survival and annihilation. Tommy Reicher had not set out to become an innovator. He had joined the Army in the spring of 1943, 1 month after his 18th birthday, caught up in the same wave of patriotic fervor that swept millions of young American men into uniform. He had trained at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where the rolling hills and thick humidity bore no resemblance to the frozen hell of the Ardennes. There, drill sergeants had screamed at him to move faster, think faster, react faster. They had taught him the liturgy of the loader's position, how to identify ammunition types by feel in total darkness, how to ram a 75mm round into the breech without crushing his fingers when the gun recoiled, how to call out up the instant the round was seated so the gunner could fire. They had drilled him until the motions became muscle memory, until he could load and reload in the darkness of a buttoned-up tank with his eyes closed, relying on touch and training and the desperate mathematics of staying alive. But nothing in training had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared any of them for the reality of combat, where tank battles did not unfold in neat exercises with clear objectives and predetermined outcomes. No one had told him that in real combat, you might fire every round in your tank and still not be finished fighting. No one had mentioned that the carefully organized ammunition racks described in Field Manual 17-67 would be emptied in the first hour of a sustained engagement, forcing him to scramble across the turret floor, opening armored hatches in the basket beneath his feet, reaching down into the wet ammunition storage bins where rounds sat in water-jacketed containers to prevent the kind of catastrophic ammunition fires that had killed so many Sherman crews in the first years of the war. The fundamental problem was one of geometry and time. The M4 Sherman, for all its mechanical reliability and ease of production, carried between 90 and 100 rounds of 75mm ammunition, depending on the variant. Sounds like plenty, sounds like enough to fight a battle and have rounds to spare. But in sustained combat against dug-in German positions reinforced with anti-tank guns, Panzer Roman IV tanks, and the dreaded Panther tanks with their sloped armor and long-barreled 75mm guns, a Sherman crew could expend ammunition at a terrifying rate. 3 rounds to take out a machine gun nest, 5 rounds to suppress an anti-tank gun position, 7 rounds expended trying to penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther before getting a shot at its thinner side armor. The mathematics of combat were brutal and unforgiving, and Tommy Reicher was the man who had to feed the beast. His position in the left side of the turret gave him access to the ready racks, the ammunition stored in easy reach for quick loading. Early Sherman tanks had stored 12 rounds in an unprotected rack around the base of the turret basket, a design flaw that turned penetrating hits into instant funeral pyres as the propellant charges ignited in a cascading chain reaction. Tankers had called those early Shermans Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company whose advertising slogan promised, "Lights first time, every time." A grim joke that barely concealed the terror of knowing that a single armor-piercing round through the turret meant death by incineration. The Army had eventually fixed the problem, removing the exposed ready racks and storing ammunition in armored boxes in the floor of the hull, surrounded by water glycol jackets to absorb heat and suppress fires. An ingenious solution that undoubtedly saved thousands of lives. But it created a new problem that Tommy was experiencing with increasing desperation this freezing January morning. Accessing that ammunition in the middle of combat was backbreaking, time-consuming, and nearly impossible when the tank was moving. The procedure went like this. When the easy-access ready racks were depleted, Tommy had to crouch down, open an armored hatch in the turret basket floor, reach down into the hull storage, open another armored door, and extract a round from the water-jacketed container. The round would be wet, slippery, cold, 33 pounds of brass casing, high explosive and steel projectile. He had to lift it up through the turret basket opening, maneuver it around the gun breech, align it with the chamber, and ram it home. Then repeat, and repeat, and repeat. In training, under controlled conditions with the tank stationary, he could maintain a rate of about 6 rounds per minute using this method. In combat, with the tank pitching over rough terrain, with the turret rotating to track new targets, with the commander shouting bearing changes over the intercom, and the driver making sudden course corrections to avoid incoming fire, that rate dropped to maybe 3 or 4 rounds per minute. Maybe, for the first month after arriving in the European theater of operations, this had seemed adequate. Their unit, Company B, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, had been part of General Patton's Third Army, participating in the rapid advance across France after the Normandy breakout. Combat had been fluid, mobile, characterized by quick engagements with retreating German forces. Shoot a few rounds, maneuver, shoot a few more. The Sherman's advantage in those conditions was its mechanical reliability and the ability to keep moving while German tanks broke down. But the Ardennes changed everything. Here the Germans had chosen to make their stand, concentrating forces in terrain that favored the defender, launching their surprise offensive when winter weather grounded Allied air support and transformed roads into ice-covered death traps. And here, on this frozen morning in January, the Patriots' promise had been engaged in continuous combat for 4 hours and 17 minutes. Tommy knew the time precisely because he had been counting rounds, counting seconds between shots, counting the number of times Sergeant Morrison's voice had come over the intercom with the same urgent command. He, bunker, 2 o'clock, or AP, tank, 11 o'clock. High explosive for infantry positions and fortifications, armor-piercing for vehicles and tank targets, each type stored in different locations in the hull, each requiring Tommy to remember, locate, extract, and load while the tank's main gun thundered and recoiled, sending spent casings clattering to the floor around his feet. They were supporting an infantry advance against a German strongpoint that intelligence had described as lightly defended. Intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. The position was anchored by at least 3 anti-tank guns, supported by entrenched infantry with machine guns and Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, and most ominously, at least 1 Panther tank that kept appearing and disappearing in the tree line like a steel phantom, firing a shot, and then backing into concealment before the American Shermans could return fire effectively. This was the German doctrine in the defensive. Use superior armor and firepower to strike from prepared positions, then displace before overwhelming American numbers could be brought to bear. And it was working. The Patriots' promise was the 3rd tank in a 5-tank platoon, positioned in the center of the formation where Tommy's commander, Sergeant Jack Morrison, could coordinate fire with the tanks on their flanks. Morrison was a 24-year-old veteran from Pennsylvania who had survived North Africa and Sicily before getting a 30-day leave stateside, and then being shipped to France in time for the autumn campaigns. He had that 1,000-yard stare that combat veterans developed, a way of looking through you rather than at you, as if part of his consciousness was always elsewhere, calculating angles and odds and the likelihood of making it through the next 5 minutes. But Morrison was also the best tank commander in the company, known for keeping his crew alive through a combination of tactical brilliance and sheer stubborn determination. Under his command, Tommy had learned to trust the system, trust the training, trust that if he did his job, the tank would do its job and they would all go home eventually. But the system was breaking down. The sustained rate of fire they were maintaining was exceeding anything the tank had been designed to deliver. Tommy's hands were raw from handling cold brass and wet steel. His back screamed in protest every time he bent down to access the floor storage. His loader's position, which in training had seemed spacious compared to other tanks, now felt like a vertical coffin as he maneuvered around the recoiling gun, dodging the breech as it slammed backward with each shot, avoiding the spent casings that littered the floor like brass snowdrifts. And then came the moment that changed everything. Morrison's voice over the intercom, urgent but controlled. 2 o'clock, bunker, rapid fire. The infantry was pinned down by a machine gun nest that had stopped their advance cold. The Sherman's mission in combined arms warfare was to be the hammer that broke enemy positions so the infantry could maneuver. Tommy reached down, opened the turret basket hatch, groped for the armored storage door in the hull. His cold-numbed fingers found the latch, pulled it open. He extracted a high-explosive round, wet and heavy, brought it up through the turret basket, rammed it home. Up, the gun fired, the breech recoiled, the spent casing ejected. He reached down again. Another round. Up, fire, recoil, eject, again and again. Morrison was walking the rounds onto target, adjusting fire. The time-tested artillery method adapted to tank gunnery, but each round required Tommy to execute the same exhausting sequence of movements, and he could feel his arms beginning to shake with fatigue, could feel the half-second delays creeping into his timing as exhausted muscles refused to respond quite as quickly as his brain commanded. In the forward hull, the driver, Private Luis Gonzalez from Los Angeles, was fighting his own battle to keep the tank positioned behind a slight rise that provided hull-down protection, showing only the turret to the enemy while keeping the more vulnerable lower hull shielded by the terrain. The co-driver, Private Raymond Chen from San Francisco, was manning the bow-mounted .30 caliber machine gun, firing suppressing bursts at any German infantry who showed themselves. In the turret, Corporal Pete Lawson, the gunner from Nebraska who could put rounds through a window at 1,000 yards, kept his eye pressed to the periscopic sight, tracking targets as Morrison called them out, making the minute adjustments to the gun's elevation and traverse that meant the difference between a hit and a miss. 5 men, each performing a specialized role, each dependent on the others, each link in a chain that was only as strong as its weakest connection. And right now, Tommy Reicher was that weak connection. He could feel it, could see it in the frustrated glances Lawson threw his way when the loading took half a second too long, could hear it in Morrison's voice, still controlled but with an edge of tension creeping in, could sense it in the way the tank seemed to pause between shots, vulnerable, exposed, giving the enemy that extra instant to aim, to fire, to kill them all. But Tommy Reicher was also an American, and Americans, as the saying went, had a gift for improvisation. It was not just a cultural stereotype. It was documented in after-action reports, in German intelligence assessments, in the observations of Allied commanders. American soldiers, particularly those who had grown up during the Depression, had developed a national talent for making do with whatever was at hand. They had grown up fixing cars with baling wire, repairing farm equipment with scrap metal, building radios from spare parts. When they joined the Army and found that official solutions to problems did not exist or did not work well enough, they simply invented their own. This had given rise to field modifications that became legendary. The hedgerow cutters welded to Sherman tanks in Normandy, improvised from German beach obstacles, allowing the tanks to burst through the Norman Bocage hedgerows instead of climbing over them and exposing their vulnerable belly armor. The extra armor plates welded to vulnerable spots. The sandbags piled on glacis plates for additional protection against shape-charge weapons. The Army called it field expedient modification. The soldiers called it using your head. The Marines called it adapting and overcoming. The Germans, in their intelligence reports, called it a distinctly American characteristic that gave U.S. forces an edge in fluid battlefield conditions. So on the night of January 16, 1945, after a day of brutal combat that had left the Patriots' promise with damaged road wheels, a cracked periscope, and a crew too exhausted to eat the cold rations that passed for dinner, Tommy Reicher had a moment of inspiration. Or perhaps desperation. The line between the two was thin when you were 20 years old and scared, and so tired that you could barely remember what it felt like to be clean and warm and safe. The problem, stripped to its essence, was one of sequential movement. He had to reach down, open hatches, extract ammunition, and bring it up to loading position. Each of these movements took time and energy. But what if he could pre-position ammunition closer to the breech? What if he could create a sort of conveyor belt of ready rounds that eliminated the constant up and down motion? The tank's design did include ready racks for this purpose, but they held too few rounds for sustained combat. What he needed was additional ready storage that could be accessed without the awkward reaching and bending that was slowing him down and exhausting him. In the dim light of a shielded flashlight, no white light allowed after dark, German snipers loved to target light sources. Tommy examined the interior of the turret. The loader's station had a fold-up seat, a rotating periscope for observation, and not much else. The available space was limited by the main gun, the recoil mechanism, the turret ring, the radio equipment in the turret bustle behind Morrison's position. But there was space along the turret wall to his left, perhaps 18 inches wide and 5 feet tall, currently occupied by nothing but air and the occasional tool or equipment strap. What he needed was a system, call it a rack, a holder, a belt, that could store perhaps a dozen rounds in immediate reach without interfering with the gun's recoil or the turret's rotation. It needed to be positioned so he could grab rounds without looking, without bending, without wasting motion or time. It needed to hold the rounds securely enough that they would not fall out when the tank was moving, but loosely enough that he could extract them quickly. And it needed to be made from whatever materials he could scavenge, because there was no going to the supply sergeant with a requisition form for one each: ammunition holder, improvised loader's station. He started with canvas. Every tank carried extra canvas tarps for camouflage, for rigging shelters when they bedded down for the night, for covering equipment. Tommy liberated a section of tarp that had been damaged by shrapnel, cut it into strips using his trench knife, and began to fashion a series of pouches, each sized to hold a 75mm round. He stitched the canvas using heavy thread from a sewing kit intended for repairing uniforms, his cold-numbed fingers working slowly in the darkness. The pouches needed to be deep enough to secure the rounds, but open enough for quick access. He created a series of pockets, 7 in all, arranged vertically along a canvas backing strip. But canvas alone would not hold the weight. A 75mm round weighed 33 pounds. 7 rounds meant 230 pounds of dead weight that would simply tear through canvas and collapse. He needed structure, support, framework, and that meant metal. The Ardennes in January of 1945 was a landscape littered with the detritus of war. Destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, shell casings by the thousands. Tommy spent part of his guard duty shift scrounging through the battalion's vehicle graveyard, the area where damaged tanks and trucks were cannibalized for parts. He found sections of metal strapping from shipping crates, strips of steel from damaged fenders, even pieces of German equipment including part of a Panzerfaust launch tube. Using a combination of pilfered tools, some creative bending, and several hours of work that left his hands blistered and bleeding, he fashioned a framework of metal strips that could be bolted to the turret wall using existing bolt holes. The design was elegant in its simplicity. The metal framework provided horizontal support bars at 7 different levels. The canvas pouches were secured to these bars, creating pockets that held each round at a slight downward angle, gravity helping to keep them in place, but also making them easy to extract with an upward pull. The entire assembly could be bolted to the turret wall in less than 10 minutes using existing mounting points. And crucially, it did not interfere with the gun's recoil path or the turret's rotation. When he showed his creation to the crew the next morning, their reactions ranged from skeptical to openly mocking. Lawson the gunner took one look and laughed. "That thing's gonna fall apart the first time we fire a round," he predicted. Chen, the co-driver, was more diplomatic. "I don't know, Tommy. Looks kinda jerry-rigged to me. What if it comes loose and jams the turret?" Even Gonzalez, usually supportive, raised concerns. "The captain sees that, he's gonna have your ass. You can't just bolt stuff to the inside of an army tank, man. That's like unauthorized modification of government property." Only Morrison, the tank commander, looked at the contraption with something other than doubt. He walked around it, examining the welds and stitching, testing the strength of the canvas pouches, checking the clearance between the improvised rack and the gun's recoil mechanism. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Load it up," he ordered. "We'll test it tomorrow morning before we move out. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, we take it down, and Tommy spends a week cleaning latrines for wasting time on arts and crafts projects." They loaded the rack with 7 high-explosive rounds, carefully positioned so the weight was evenly distributed. That night, the contraption hung from the turret wall looking like exactly what it was: a desperate improvisation, a combination of canvas and scrap metal that violated every engineering principle in the Army's technical manuals. Other crews who came by to look at the Patriots' promise had similar reactions. Some laughed, some shook their heads. One sergeant from another platoon told Morrison flatly that it was dangerous and needed to be removed before someone got killed. No one thought it would work. No one except Tommy Reicher, who had built it, and Jack Morrison, who understood that in combat, anything that might give you an edge was worth trying. The test came the next morning, January 17th, 23 degrees below freezing, the day that would become the defining moment of Tommy Reicher's war, and the vindication of American innovation in the face of doctrine and doubt. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Company B would support elements of the 26th Infantry Division in an attack on German positions blocking the road to Wiltz, Luxembourg. Intelligence, that same intelligence that was wrong so often it might as well have been reading tea leaves, reported that the Germans were withdrawing, that resistance would be light, that the attack would be more of a pursuit than a battle. The experienced soldiers listened to this briefing with the weary resignation of men who knew that intelligence was wrong more often than it was right, but who also knew that orders were orders, and the mission would proceed regardless of reality. The Patriots' promise rolled out at 0700 hours, taking its position in the platoon formation, engine rumbling, tracks clanking on the frozen ground. Inside the turret, Tommy Reicher sat at his loader's station and looked at his improvised ammunition rack. 7 rounds within arm's reach. 7 rounds that he would not have to bend down to access, would not have to extract from the floor storage, would not have to manhandle up through the turret basket opening. 7 rounds that represented 7 seconds of time saved. 7 moments where the tank could keep firing instead of pausing. 7 opportunities to hit the enemy before the enemy hit them. It took less than an hour for the mission to go wrong. The German withdrawal turned out to be a tactical repositioning to stronger defensive lines, and the American attack ran headlong into a prepared killing ground. Machine guns opened up from concealed positions. Mortar rounds began falling with that distinctive crump 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 that meant someone on the German side had pre-registered the coordinates and was simply dropping rounds into predetermined target zones. And then the anti-tank guns revealed themselves, and the distinctive crack boom of high-velocity armor-piercing rounds began snapping through the air. Morrison's voice came over the intercom, calm despite the chaos outside. "Gunner, he 2 o'clock bunker. Lawson traversed right, elevated slightly. Identified." Tommy's hand reached up, not down but up, to the improvised rack, extracted a high-explosive round in a single smooth motion, rammed it home. Up the gun fired. The breech recoiled, the spent casing ejected. Before it hit the floor, Tommy already had the next round in his hands. Another target, another shot, the rhythm of combat, but faster now, smoother. The elimination of wasted motion transforming the crew's efficiency. And then the battle intensified. More targets appeared than could be easily counted. Morrison was calling out bearing changes before Lawson had finished engaging the previous target. The infantry was pinned down, taking casualties, screaming for support over the radio. The tank platoon had to deliver suppressing fire while staying mobile, constantly shifting position to avoid becoming stationary targets for German anti-tank guns. This was the nightmare scenario that all tankers feared. Sustained combat against a prepared enemy with multiple threats coming from multiple directions. But the Patriots' promise kept firing. Tommy's improvised rack was performing exactly as designed. He would exhaust the 7 ready rounds, then take a brief pause to reload the rack from the hull storage, then resume firing. The time savings were measurable, significant. Where previously he had been the bottleneck limiting the tank's rate of fire, now he was keeping pace with Lawson's ability to acquire and engage targets. The difference was profound. The tank was firing perhaps 30% faster than before, and that 30% meant the difference between suppressing enemy positions and being suppressed by them. Other crews noticed. Over the radio net, Tommy could hear the other tank commanders calling out their ammunition status, coordinating fire, and increasingly, asking Morrison for help covering their positions while they reloaded. 347, this is 345. We're black on ammo. Need 90 seconds to reload. Can you cover our sector? Morrison would roger the request, and the Patriots' promise would shift fire to cover another tank's field of responsibility, while that crew scrambled to extract ammunition from their hull storage the slow, exhausting, standard way. The battle wore on. Minutes became hours. The temperature dropped even further as the weak winter sun climbed to its zenith, and then began its early afternoon descent. The infantry finally managed to advance under the covering fire provided by the tanks, clearing German positions with grenades and rifle fire, and the brutal close-quarters work of house-to-house fighting. The anti-tank guns were eliminated one by one, reduced to twisted metal by high-explosive rounds from the Shermans. The German strongpoint was cracked, then shattered, then overrun. By 1400 hours, the position was secured, and the American advance continued. When the tanks finally pulled back to rearm and refuel, Morrison ordered a crew meeting beside the tank. The 5 men stood in the frozen mud, breath steaming in the cold air, hands wrapped around canteen cups of coffee that the mess sergeant had somehow managed to brew. Morrison looked at each of them in turn, then fixed his gaze on Tommy Reicher. "That thing," Morrison said, gesturing toward the turret where the improvised ammunition rack was still visible through the open hatch, "probably saved our lives today. I counted the rounds. We fired 107 rounds in 4 hours. Without that rack, we'd have been dead in the water after the first hour, reloading too slow, sitting ducks. Instead, we kept every gun in this platoon in the fight. So here's what's going to happen. Tommy, you're going to teach every loader in this company how to build one of those things. We're going to scrounge materials, and by this time tomorrow, every tank in Company B is going to have one. And if the captain or the battalion commander or General Patton himself has a problem with it, they can take it up with me." Questions? There were no questions. There was only the quiet understanding that what had seemed like a joke, like a desperate improvisation that violated regulations and common sense, had proven itself in the only test that mattered: combat. The rack had worked. It had worked flawlessly, and in an army that valued results over regulations. That made it not just acceptable but exemplary. But the full significance of that frozen January day would not become clear until later. It would not become clear until the after-action reports were filed, and the battalion intelligence officer compiled statistics on ammunition expenditure and tank effectiveness. It would not become clear until other units heard about the modification and began implementing their own versions. It would not become clear until tankers who survived the war went home and told the story to anyone who would listen. The story of how a kid from Ohio with canvas and scrap metal had given Sherman crews a fighting chance in sustained combat. The deeper truth, though, was about more than just an ammunition rack. It was about the fundamental nature of American warfare in the Second World War. The United States had not entered the conflict with the world's best tanks. The Sherman was outgunned by the German Panther and Tiger, out-armored by Soviet heavy tanks, and mechanically inferior to some British designs. What America had was industrial capacity, mechanical reliability, and soldiers who refused to accept that the equipment they were given was the best equipment possible. American tankers did not just operate their vehicles. They modified them, improved them, adapted them to the specific requirements of combat as they experienced it rather than as some engineer in Detroit had imagined it. This was the pattern repeated across every theater of the war. In North Africa, American tankers learned that the Sherman's narrow tracks caused it to bog down in desert sand, so they welded on extended end connectors, creating what became known as duck-bill extended end tracks that distributed weight more effectively. In Normandy, they faced the impenetrable hedgerows of the French bocage and invented the Rhino hedgerow cutter, essentially a set of steel tusks that allowed them to smash through vegetation instead of climbing over it. In the Pacific, Marines added improvised armor to protect against Japanese close assault tactics. The pattern was always the same: encounter a problem, improvise a solution, share it with other units, iterate and improve. The Germans, by contrast, approached warfare with a different philosophy. Their equipment was often superior in individual technical specifications, but it was also rigid, inflexible, designed to operate in a specific way under specific conditions. When those conditions changed, the German response was to design a new piece of equipment through official channels, a process that could take months or years. The Americans simply grabbed a welding torch and fixed the problem themselves. This difference in approach reflected deeper cultural distinctions. Germany was a society that valued order, hierarchy, precision engineering, and following established procedures. America was a society that valued individual initiative, practical problem-solving, and a certain disregard for authority when authority seemed to be getting in the way of getting the job done. The German Panther tank was a masterpiece of engineering. The American Sherman was a workhorse that could be modified in the field with spare parts and ingenuity. Which approach was superior? The answer was written in the outcome of the war. Tommy Reicher's ammunition rack became something more than just a piece of field expedient equipment. It became a symbol. When word spread through the 4th Armored Division about the modification, other units began implementing their own versions. Some used different materials, metal brackets instead of canvas pouches, or wooden frames instead of steel strapping. Some positioned the racks differently depending on the available space in different Sherman variants. But the principle was the same: pre-position ammunition in immediate reach to maximize the loader's efficiency and increase the tank's sustained rate of fire. By February of 1945, estimates suggested that more than 60% of Sherman tanks in some frontline units had some form of improvised ammunition rack installed. The modification was never officially sanctioned by the Army Ordnance Department. It never appeared in updated technical manuals or field manuals, but it spread through the informal network of shared knowledge that connected tankers across units. The kind of frontline innovation that happened when soldiers talked to each other and shared solutions to common problems. And the impact was measurable. Tank crews equipped with improved ammunition racks reported average increases in sustained rate of fire between 25 and 40%, depending on conditions. More importantly, they reported reduced fatigue for loaders, which meant better performance later in extended engagements. A loader who could maintain his rate of fire for 4 hours was more valuable than a loader who could fire slightly faster for 1 hour before exhaustion degraded his performance. The modification did not just make tanks more effective, it made crews more survivable. There was something profoundly democratic about this process of innovation. It was not generals or engineers who improved the Sherman. It was young men like Tommy Reicher, enlisted soldiers with high school educations and practical skills learned on Depression-era farms and in small-town machine shops. They did not wait for permission. They did not file reports or requisition forms. They simply identified a problem and fixed it, using whatever materials were at hand and whatever knowledge they possessed. This was American warfare at its most elemental, practical, pragmatic, and effective. The symbolism extended beyond the battlefield. When Americans back home read newspaper accounts or heard radio reports about the ingenuity of their soldiers, it reinforced a national narrative about American exceptionalism that was rooted not in claims of superiority, but in demonstrated adaptability. The message was clear. American soldiers might not have the best equipment, but they had the ability to make their equipment better. They had the initiative to identify problems and the practical skills to solve them. This was not propaganda. It was documented reality, repeated in thousands of small innovations across every theater of war. The Germans recognized this quality in their opponents and feared it. Captured German intelligence documents from late in the war frequently mentioned the American talent for adaptation and improvisation as a significant battlefield advantage. One report from December 1944 noted that American tank crews were modifying their vehicles faster than German intelligence could track the modifications, making it difficult to predict American tactical capabilities. Another report observed that American soldiers seemed to approach warfare as a problem to be solved rather than a ritual to be performed. And this fundamental difference in mindset gave them an edge in fluid combat situations. But perhaps the most telling recognition came not from enemy intelligence, but from the American soldiers themselves. In the years after the war, when veterans gathered to tell their stories, they did not talk about the specifications of their equipment or the strategic brilliance of their commanders. They talked about the small things, the tricks they learned, the modifications they made, the ways they had figured out how to survive. Tommy Reicher's story became one of thousands, a single thread in a larger tapestry of improvisation and adaptation that characterized the American experience in the Second World War. The improvised ammunition rack became for Tommy what other symbolic objects became for other soldiers. For infantrymen, it might be a particular rifle that they had broken in and knew intimately. For engineers, a particular tool that had saved lives. For tankers like Tommy, it was this piece of canvas and scrap metal that represented the difference between the official Army way of doing things and the way things actually worked in combat. It represented the gap between doctrine and reality, and the American willingness to close that gap through innovation rather than simply accepting it as inevitable. And it represented something else: abundance. This was perhaps the most fundamental advantage that American forces brought to the battlefield. Not just material abundance, though that was certainly part of it, but abundance of creativity, abundance of initiative, abundance of the willingness to try new approaches and abandon them if they did not work. The Germans were constrained by scarcity, by the knowledge that every tank destroyed could not be replaced. Every innovation had to be carefully vetted because resources for experimentation were limited. The Americans operated in an environment of relative abundance, where if an idea did not work, you could simply try another idea. If a modification failed, you could remove it and try something else. This freedom to experiment, to fail without catastrophic consequences, enabled a pace of innovation that more rigid systems could not match. Tommy's rack was built from salvaged materials, not because America lacked the ability to manufacture purpose-built equipment, but because field improvisation was faster than waiting for official solutions. The materials represented the abundance of an industrial society at war, so much equipment being produced that there was scrap available for soldiers to use in unauthorized ways. So many resources flowing to the front that a 20-year-old private could afford to waste several hours building something that might not work without fear that those hours should have been spent on something more officially sanctioned. This stood in stark contrast to the German experience. By January 1945, German tank crews were often forced to cannibalize 3 or 4 disabled tanks to keep one operational. They lacked spare parts, lacked ammunition, lacked fuel. The idea of using scarce materials to build experimental modifications would have been unthinkable. Every resource had to be devoted to immediate operational necessity. There was no margin for experimentation, no surplus of materials or time that could be invested in trying new approaches. The Germans were fighting from a position of scarcity, and scarcity enforces conservatism. When you cannot afford failure, you do not take risks. The Americans, operating from abundance, could afford to let a 20-year-old loader spend several hours building an ammunition rack that might not work. They could afford to let him bolt it to the inside of an army tank in violation of regulations. They could afford to let him test it in combat because even if it failed, even if it somehow contributed to the tank being lost, there were more tanks being produced every day in factories in Detroit and Gary and a dozen other cities. This was not callousness about human life. Every loss was mourned, but rather a recognition that innovation required the freedom to fail, and that freedom could only exist in an environment of abundance. The contrast extended to how the two sides approached the human element of warfare. German military doctrine emphasized obedience, discipline, following orders exactly as given. Initiative was valued at the officer level, but discouraged among enlisted ranks. The German army was not interested in hearing suggestions from privates about how to improve equipment or tactics. That was the responsibility of officers and engineers, and the system was explicitly hierarchical. The American approach was different, not because Americans were inherently more democratic in military organization. The U.S. Army was just as hierarchical in its formal structure, but because American culture placed greater value on individual initiative even within hierarchical systems. An American sergeant might tell a private to solve a problem without specifying exactly how to solve it, trusting that the private would figure something out. This trust was not naivete, but rather a recognition that the men closest to a problem often had the best understanding of potential solutions. Tommy Reicher was trusted to spend his off-duty hours building an ammunition rack, without getting permission from higher authority. Morrison was trusted to allow that rack to be installed and tested without consulting the company commander. The company commander, when he eventually learned about the modification, was trusted to make a battlefield judgment about whether to authorize it rather than strictly following regulations that said no unauthorized modifications were permitted. At every level, there was a degree of flexibility that allowed good ideas to propagate rapidly from the bottom up, rather than slowly filtering down from the top. This flexibility was both a strength and a source of chaos. American units were notorious for having non-standard equipment configurations, for operating in ways that did not match official doctrine, for solving problems in creative ways that made it difficult for higher headquarters to predict exactly what capabilities were available. But this chaos was productive chaos, the kind of disorder that emerges when you prioritize effectiveness over standardization. The Germans looked at American units and saw undisciplined rabble that did not follow proper procedures. What they failed to recognize was that this apparent lack of discipline was actually a different kind of discipline. The discipline to focus on results rather than process, to value what worked rather than what was officially correct. The Battle of the Bulge ended officially on January 25, 1945. The German offensive had been stopped, then reversed, then crushed. The Allies resumed their advance into Germany. The war in Europe would continue for another 3 months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany would be defeated, not because any single battle had been decisive, but because of accumulated advantages. Industrial production, air superiority, logistics, and the cumulative effect of thousands of small innovations like Tommy Reicher's ammunition rack that gave Allied forces incremental edges that added up to overwhelming superiority. Tommy Reicher survived the war. He returned to Dayton, Ohio in November of 1945, took advantage of the G.I. Bill to attend college, and eventually became a teacher. He rarely spoke about his military service. Like many veterans, he found that the intensity of combat experience did not translate well to civilian conversation, that people who had not been there could not really understand what it had been like, and that trying to explain often felt more exhausting than simply staying silent. But he kept the photographs from his service, including one that showed the Patriot's promise with his improvised ammunition rack visible through the open turret hatch. In the decades after the war, he would sometimes take out that photograph and look at it, remembering the cold morning in Belgium when a desperate improvisation had been tested and proven. Other members of his crew stayed in touch sporadically. Morrison made a career in the Army, retiring as a colonel in 1968. Lawson went back to Nebraska and ran a successful farm. Gonzalez settled in California and raised a family. Chen became an engineer. They would reunite occasionally at veterans' gatherings, and when they did, the conversation would eventually turn to that January day, to the battle that had tested them and the improvised rack that had kept them fighting. In later years, as military historians began conducting oral history interviews with World War II veterans, Tommy's story was recorded as one example among thousands of battlefield innovation. The historians were interested in the broader patterns, how American forces adapted to combat conditions, how unofficial modifications spread through units, how the Army's formal structure accommodated or resisted informal innovation. Tommy's rack was a perfect case study because it illustrated all of these dynamics. It showed how a problem was identified by someone at the lowest level of the military hierarchy. It showed how a solution was improvised using available materials. It showed how the modification was tested and validated in combat. And it showed how the innovation spread through informal networks to other units, eventually becoming widespread despite never being officially sanctioned. The historians noted that this pattern was distinctly American. British forces had their own innovations, but they tended to follow more formal channels, with modifications being submitted up the chain of command for evaluation before implementation. Soviet forces were even more rigid, with unauthorized modifications potentially being treated as sabotage or dereliction of duty. The German approach has already been discussed. Only the Americans seem to have developed a military culture that could accommodate and even encourage this kind of bottom-up innovation, while still maintaining sufficient discipline and cohesion to function as an effective fighting force. This was not an accident. It reflected conscious decisions made by American military planners in the interwar years about how to structure training and doctrine. The emphasis on initiative and problem-solving had been deliberate, based on lessons from the First World War and observations of other militaries. American planners recognized that modern warfare was too complex and fast-moving for centralized decision-making to be effective. They needed junior leaders and even individual soldiers who could make decisions, solve problems, and adapt to changing circumstances without waiting for orders from higher authority. The training at places like Fort Knox was designed to produce this kind of soldier, technically proficient, capable of following orders, but also capable of independent thought and action when circumstances demanded it. Tommy Reicher was the product of this system. His technical training had given him the knowledge to understand how the Sherman's ammunition system worked, and why the standard design was inadequate for sustained combat. His practical skills, learned growing up in Ohio during the Depression, gave him the ability to fabricate a solution from available materials. His military training had instilled in him the confidence to try his idea without seeking permission. And the culture of his unit, shaped by Morrison's leadership style and the broader American military culture, created an environment where his innovation could be tested and adopted. All of these factors had to align for the improvised rack to succeed. Remove any one of them. The technical knowledge, the practical skills, the initiative, the supportive command environment, and the rack either would not have been built or would not have been allowed to be tested. This alignment was not unique to Tommy's crew, or even to the 4th Armored Division. It was characteristic of American military culture in World War II, and it manifested in thousands of small innovations across all theaters and all branches of service. The rack itself, that specific combination of canvas and scrap metal, was eventually lost. The Patriot's Promise survived the war and was shipped back to the United States, but like most military equipment, it was eventually scrapped. The rack was removed before the tank was decommissioned, and its ultimate fate is unknown. Probably it was thrown in a scrap pile and eventually melted down and turned into something else. The specific artifact was lost, but its legacy endured. That legacy was about more than just ammunition racks. It was about the fundamental principle that effectiveness matters more than orthodoxy, that results matter more than procedure, that soldiers closest to the problem often have the best understanding of potential solutions. These principles would continue to influence American military doctrine long after World War II ended. They would shape the development of military equipment, the structure of training programs, the culture of military units. The lesson of Tommy Reicher's rack was not that every soldier should be modifying their equipment. Uncontrolled modification creates its own problems, but rather that the military should create space for innovation, should listen to feedback from frontline users, should be willing to adopt good ideas regardless of their source. In the decades after the war, as the Army modernized and professionalized, there would be periodic tensions between the need for standardization and the value of innovation. Standardization made logistics easier, made training more efficient, made it easier to predict capabilities and coordinate operations. But standardization also risked suppressing the kind of innovation that Tommy Reicher had demonstrated. The challenge was to find the balance, to maintain enough standardization for efficient operations, while still allowing enough flexibility for adaptation and innovation. Different eras struck this balance differently. In the immediate post-war period, the Army was perhaps more tolerant of field modifications than it had been before the war, based on the positive experiences in World War II. By the Vietnam era, increased bureaucratization had made unauthorized modifications more difficult, though they still occurred. In the modern era, with more sophisticated and expensive equipment, the tolerance for field modifications has decreased further, though the principle of listening to user feedback and rapidly incorporating good ideas has become more institutionalized through formal processes. But the fundamental lesson remained, the lesson that Tommy Reicher learned on a frozen morning in Belgium in January 1945, the lesson that was written in canvas and scrap metal and validated in combat, the lesson that effectiveness must be the ultimate arbiter of military worth, that good ideas can come from anywhere, that soldiers who are trusted to solve problems will often exceed expectations. There is a particular kind of poetry in the fact that this lesson was learned and demonstrated in a tank battle. Tanks represented the height of modern military technology in World War II, complex machines that combined armor, firepower, and mobility in ways that previous generations could not have imagined. They were products of industrial society, of mass production, of engineering sophistication. Yet the improvement that made them more effective came not from engineers or generals, but from a 20-year-old private with a needle and thread and some scrap metal. The highest technology was made more effective by the most basic improvisation. This juxtaposition captured something essential about the American way of war. It was never just about having the best technology, though America's industrial capacity certainly helped. It was about the combination of technology and human ingenuity, the synthesis of industrial production and individual initiative. The Sherman tank was a good design not because it was the best tank in terms of specifications, but because it was a design that could be produced in quantity, maintained in the field, and improved by the people who operated it. It was democratic in both senses of the word, produced by a democratic society, and improved by soldiers who were treated as thinking participants rather than just cogs in a machine. And so Tommy Reicher's story became part of the larger American story of World War II. Not the story of great generals and strategic decisions, though those mattered. Not the story of heroic last stands and desperate battles, though those occurred, but the quieter story of competence and adaptability, of young men who found themselves thrust into war and responded by simply trying to do their jobs as effectively as possible, by identifying problems and solving them, by refusing to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. The rack itself was a small thing, canvas and metal, a few hours of work, unsanctioned, unauthorized, technically in violation of regulations, but it represented something larger, the capacity for innovation under pressure, the willingness to take initiative, the practical problem-solving that characterized the American approach to warfare. These qualities did not guarantee victory in any single engagement. Plenty of American forces lost battles, despite being innovative and adaptable. But across thousands of engagements, across millions of soldiers and thousands of days of combat, these qualities accumulated into a decisive advantage. The Germans had better tanks in many respects, but they lost the tank war. They lost it not in any single battle, but in the accumulated weight of American industrial production, tactical flexibility, and the kind of small innovations that Tommy Reicher represented. Each improvised rack, each hedgerow cutter, each field modification was a small advantage. Multiply those advantages across tens of thousands of tanks and millions of soldiers, and the result was an army that could learn, adapt, and improve faster than its opponents. This was the essence of American military power in World War II. Not perfection, but adaptability. Not the best individual technologies, but the best system for improving and deploying technology. Not the most rigidly disciplined army, but the most flexibly organized one. Not soldiers who followed orders unthinkingly, but soldiers who understood the mission and found ways to accomplish it even when the prescribed methods proved inadequate. And it all came back to that cold morning in Belgium, to a young man standing beside his tank with blistered hands and a contraption made of canvas and scrap metal, to the moment when improvisation was tested and proven, to the validation of the American faith that practical problem-solving and individual initiative could make a difference in the largest and most destructive conflict in human history. The rack hangs invisible now in the space between past and present, between what was official and what was effective, between the way things were supposed to work and the way they actually worked. It exists in photographs and after-action reports, and the memories of old men who were young once and cold and scared, but who found within themselves the capacity to adapt and overcome. It exists in the principle that good ideas matter regardless of their source, that the test of effectiveness is combat rather than conformity, that the men who use equipment often understand it better than the men who designed it. And it exists in the larger truth that America did not win World War II through superior ideology or racial destiny or manifest destiny, or any of the other grand narratives that nations tell themselves. America won through the accumulated effect of millions of small decisions made by millions of people, most of them young, most of them thrust into circumstances they never chose, who nevertheless found within themselves the capacity to identify problems and solve them, to adapt and improve, to take the equipment they were given, and make it better because better meant the difference between living and dying. Tommy Reicher's improvised ammunition rack was one small thread in that larger tapestry. But it was a thread that held, that proved strong when tested, that exemplified something essential about the nation that produced it and the men who fought for it. It was, in the end, exactly what it appeared to be: canvas and scrap metal and practical ingenuity, built by cold hands in desperate circumstances, tested in combat and proven effective. It was the American way of war reduced to its essence. It was democracy in action at the most fundamental level. It was the proof that trust in individual initiative, that faith in practical problem-solving, that willingness to try new approaches could make the difference between victory and defeat. And that truth, forged in Belgium in January 1945, validated by 4 hours of sustained combat and the survival of 5 men who might otherwise have died, remains relevant. Because warfare continues to evolve, technology continues to advance, challenges continue to emerge. But the fundamental principle does not change. The principle that effectiveness matters, that innovation emerges from unexpected sources, that the men and women closest to problems often have the best understanding of solutions, that equipment is only as good as the people who use it, and the culture that allows them to improve it. Tommy Reicher built an ammunition rack from canvas and scrap metal, but what he really built was a demonstration of principle, a proof of concept, a validation of the American military culture that trusted its soldiers to be thinking participants rather than mindless executors of orders. That rack, that principle, that trust, these were the weapons that won wars. Not by themselves, of course. Wars are won by many factors operating in combination. But among those factors, among the elements that gave American forces their edge, this particular quality, the ability to adapt, to innovate, to improve, was as important as industrial production or strategic air power, or any of the more traditionally recognized elements of military strength. The rack does not exist anymore, except in memory and record. The men who built it and used it are nearly all gone now, time claiming what war did not. But the lesson endures, the lesson that began with a 20-year-old loader on a frozen morning in Belgium, holding a contraption of canvas and scrap metal, wondering if it would work, knowing that combat would provide the only test that mattered. The lesson that was learned when that rack proved effective, when it kept a Sherman tank in the fight, when it exemplified the American capacity for practical innovation under pressure. The lesson that spread through a company, a battalion, a division, becoming part of the informal knowledge that frontline soldiers shared. The lesson that helped win a war and defined a military culture, and demonstrated that sometimes the difference between defeat and victory, between death and survival, between failure and success, comes down to the willingness of ordinary people to try solving problems in new ways, using whatever materials are at hand, trusting in the practical ingenuity that is perhaps humanity's greatest gift. They laughed at his DIY ammunition belt, canvas and scrap metal, unauthorized and unsanctioned, built in violation of regulations by a private with blistered hands and desperate hope. They laughed until it worked, until it kept firing when other tanks fell silent, until it proved that innovation and effectiveness matter more than orthodoxy and approval, until it saved a Sherman tank and the 5 men inside it on a frozen morning in Belgium, when the outcome of the war hung in balance, and every small advantage accumulated into the difference between victory and defeat. They laughed, and then they learned, and then they won.